He left before he was ready. No teacher beside him, no stars he truly understood. Only a canoe, some dried food, and a sky that kept shifting when he needed it most. There are voyages that begin with confidence. This was not one of them. Each wave raised a question. Each night brought a sky he couldn't read. What do you hold on to when the stars feel unfamiliar? And the sea seems to know more than you do? This is the quiet trial of a voyager unprepared, and the subtle strength found only when no one is watching. Close your eyes and let your breath slow. Picture a stretch of sea so vast that it seems to have no beginning and no end. The air is warm and salted. The breeze carries the faint scent of dried breadfruit, sun-warmed wood, and distant rain. You're standing on the deck of a canoe that doesn't creak or groan but glides, quietly, over waves as smooth as folded linen. Around you, the ocean breathes in long, steady rhythms, and the sky overhead holds a language older than maps. No sails flap, no voices shout. There is only the hush of wind on skin and the memory of stars that once shone brighter before they were forgotten or stolen or simply misplaced in the long flow of time. In this stillness, we begin the story of a boy and the sky he could not read. Yet. The first time Tanoa touched the lashings on a canoe mast, he had no idea what they meant. He was small then, maybe 8, maybe younger, sitting in the shadow of his uncle's back as the older man rewrapped the bark cord that held the mast steady. It was slow work. His uncle, Tamuri, spoke almost nothing that day. Just the occasional clearing of his throat and the occasional squint upward at the sun, judging how much light was left before the tide would rise enough to carry the craft into the channel. Tanoa had no brothers, and most of the boys in his village were already old enough to be assigned proper instruction. He had been slower to grow, less nimble with the paddles, more inclined to ask why the stars had names no one used anymore. But he was persistent. Not brave, at least not yet, but persistent in a way that wore people down over time. His uncle tolerated him because he asked few questions when the work was quiet. By 13, he could tie a sail without looking. He had learned which leaves curled when storms approached, and which clouds stayed flat and motionless even when the wind changed. What he hadn't learned, what no one yet trusted him to learn, was the reading of the stars. That was kept quiet, handed only to those who had memorized the chants, not simply the movements of light, but the histories attached to them. Tanoa was not told why, only that some stars were no longer spoken of, as if forgetting them had been necessary. The elders said the breadfruit harvest was late that year. Some blamed the ocean current, which had pushed warm waters farther west than usual. Others said the winds had shifted earlier than expected. Tanoa knew the cause hardly mattered. Late harvest meant the annual canoe journey to the outer islets would be delayed, and with it, his only chance to travel beyond the reef. He watched as the older boys trained in navigation, drawing paths in the sand with sticks, positioning shells as stars, sweeping them away again when mistakes were noticed. They would leave soon. He would stay behind. But then, something changed. A shallow storm, the kind that skirts the outer horizon and never makes landfall, passed too close. It scattered fish and debris across the shallows and forced one of the navigators to remain behind with a bruised leg. They needed a replacement, not to guide the voyage, but to cook, to paddle when told, to repair rope. It wasn't a prestigious position. It didn't require knowledge of wind shifts or constellations. It simply required being strong enough to carry fresh water and silent enough to not disturb those who carried the maps in their heads. Tanoa volunteered, and no one stopped him. The canoe was longer than any he'd touched before. Its hulls had been smoothed with stone over many seasons, and its crossbeams carried tiny carvings, some faded, some freshly etched. He didn't ask about them. Instead, he memorized the way his pack fit beneath the bench, how the breadfruit was wrapped in dried leaves, how the gourds were lashed tightly so they wouldn't shift during rough water. Every small task became a ritual, a way to prove quietly that he deserved to be there. The voyage began at dusk, not sunrise, as most assumed, but dusk, when the first stars appeared and the sea turned black and featureless. The navigator, a man named Cal, stood barefoot at the front, eyes half closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. He didn't speak. He simply pointed with his chin, and the canoe shifted slowly and without ceremony away from the shoreline. Tanoa didn't sleep that first night. He listened to the water slide along the hulls, the creak of rope, the soft snore of the boy beside him. He stared at the stars. Some he knew, at least by shape if not by name. A triangle low on the horizon that pointed east, a narrow curve above it that shimmered slightly green. Others looked unfamiliar, or perhaps they were familiar but from a new angle. He couldn't tell. On the third day, the wind dropped. The sails loosened, fluttered, and then hung limp. Cale said nothing. He simply sat, fingers resting on the hull, face turned upward, unmoving. The others followed suit. This was not seen as danger. It was a pause, an invitation to wait. The canoe drifted slowly, its shadow blending into the ocean. They drifted for hours, then a whole day. The breadfruit grew soft. The water was rationed. Tanoa tried to measure the wind in his fingertips, the way he'd seen Hina do when she visited their village in past seasons. She would sit cross-legged, one arm lifted slightly, palm open, fingers relaxed. The breeze, if there was any, would lift her hair, tug at her sleeve. But she never seemed to react. She would only hum, almost inaudibly, and eventually she would stand and say, "Northwest, 2 lengths." That was all, and she was rarely wrong. But now there was no wind, only heat, and the silent worry that drifted among the crew like mist. Tanoa whispered to himself, trying to remember the chant about clouds that build without rain. But the words slipped out of order. He tried again, and again. That evening, Cale finally spoke. "The stars have gone wrong," he said. It was not shouted. It was not even spoken with fear. Just a statement, as if a net had been cast and returned empty. The older boys looked at each other. Tanoa sat still. "There are some stars," Cale continued, "that do not return, that do not wish to be found. And tonight, they are gone." No one answered. Tanoa felt his stomach twist, not from hunger, but from something less familiar. A wrongness. A silence that came not from peace, but from absence. If stars could go missing, what else could vanish? The crew waited through the night. When dawn returned, the wind did not. Cale instructed them to paddle toward the sun until its heat was no longer on their shoulders. It was slow work. The ocean offered no resistance, but no help either. Only the steady slap of paddles and the occasional distant cry of a bird too high to see. That afternoon, Cale handed Tanoa a dried piece of breadfruit and said, "Watch the edges." The boy obeyed. The fruit's edges curled more quickly on one side than the other. He didn't understand the meaning until Cale said, "Heat escapes faster on the side where the wind wishes to return." It was not a scientific explanation, but it was enough. They turned the canoe slightly. 2 hours later, a faint breeze returned. The sail was raised. They moved again. That night, Tanoa stayed close to Cale. He watched the man's face as he studied the sky. There was no fear in his features, only concentration and a kind of deep listening. "There are no stolen stars," Cale said, unprompted. "Only misplaced names." Tanoa blinked. Cale pointed to a faint smudge of light low on the horizon. "We forgot the name of that one, so we stopped using it. But it never stopped burning." Tanoa's throat felt dry, not from thirst, but from the weight of understanding. The stars hadn't gone. Their names had. And with those names, the routes they marked, the winds they called forth, the songs they once accompanied, It wasn't the stars who had vanished. It was the people's memory. Kaylee leaned closer. You're not here to paddle, not only. You're here to remember what others chose to forget. Tanoa said nothing, but inside him, something rearranged. He understood now that the voyage was not simply from island to island. It was from silence to speech, from forgetting to naming, from drift to direction. They arrived 2 days later, guided not by familiar constellations, but by wind, memory, and the faint scent of breadfruit smoke from a distant cooking fire. The island was small, the sand coarse and white, the trees bowed by wind. The journey had taken longer than expected, but they had arrived. As the canoe was pulled ashore, Kale placed his hand briefly on Tanoa's shoulder and said, "One day, you will tell others how to see stars again. Not just with eyes, but with hands, with stories, with stillness." Tanoa looked to the sky. The stars were there, dimmer than before, or perhaps not. Perhaps he had simply not yet learned how to see them. The morning sun was gentle on the small island, filtering through pandanus leaves and dappling the sandy floor with scattered patches of gold. Birds moved quietly between trees, their wings flicking against trunks in irregular rhythms. Smoke from a cooking fire trailed upward, light and slow, not stirred by wind, but by the heat of coals below. Tanoa sat cross-legged beside the canoe, now secured to a set of worn driftwood posts, its bow wrapped in dried vines to keep it from drifting. His fingers absent-mindedly traced patterns into the sand, curved lines, spirals, not unlike the etchings he'd once seen carved onto older canoes. The previous night's voyage still floated in his thoughts. The missing stars, the words Kale had spoken about, names lost, routes forgotten, guidance once strong but now buried beneath silence. He found himself looking at the sky more now, not for direction, but for memory. He wanted to know what had been erased and how. He wondered if he would ever be trusted to speak of stars himself, or if he would spend his life carrying only the edges of other people's knowledge. Kale emerged from the grove behind the village, with a bundle of leaves slung across his back and a strip of woven matting tied around his waist. He moved slowly, not because of age, but because he seemed to think between every step. "The breadfruit here is heavier," he said as he set the bundle down. "Richer with oil. It dries slower. That means the trees drink less wind." Tanoa blinked, unsure if he had misheard. "The trees drink the wind?" Kaylee nodded without looking at him. "You'll understand when we leave. Watch the leaves, they move slower. The breeze here is cautious." The idea felt absurd, but it stayed with Tanoa. He followed Kale as they helped the villagers prepare bundles of preserved food and freshwater gourds for the return journey. The islanders spoke little, and when they did, it was mostly about practical things. How much to carry, which ropes needed repair, which reef pass would be safest with the tide due to shift. Tanoa noticed they rarely looked at the sky when they spoke. Their attention stayed on the trees, the sea foam, the movement of insects and birds. He wondered if this was another way of reading, the kind not taught in chants or constellations, but in things close and slow. Later, while mending a fraying edge of sailcloth beneath a palm, Tanoa asked one of the older island men about the forgotten stars. The man laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of tired fondness. "They're not forgotten," he said. "They were put aside. Some names were too long to remember. Others reminded us of things we wished we hadn't known. When a storm comes, do you remember every wave, or only the ones that nearly broke the canoe?" Tanoa nodded slowly. The man returned to sharpening the edge of a canoe paddle, scraping smooth strokes of stone against wood. The wind rustled the trees gently, just enough to sway the outer leaves but not the branches. Tanoa watched them with new attention. That evening, Kale brought out a bowl of fermented taro and passed it around the fire. The apprentices, including 2 older boys who had taken the voyage before, sat in a half circle, feet tucked under them, back straight but relaxed. Kale said little. He waited until the fire had burned low enough for the sparks to rise slowly and the heat to settle into embers. Then, quietly, he pointed toward a gap in the trees where a cluster of stars hovered just above the water. "Do you see the crooked one?" he asked. Tanoa squinted. "The one near the long blue line?" "Yes. That's the one we called the canoe's tail." Tanoa hesitated. "But I thought that was Timanua." "It was," Kale said. "Then it wasn't. Then it was again, but in a different story." Silence followed. The fire cracked once. Kale looked at the stars again. "Names change, but shapes don't. If you remember the shape, the name will come when you need it." That night, lying in a hammock made of knotted fiber, Tanoa repeated the shapes in his mind. He pictured the lines that connected them, the tail, the spine, the forward sail, and imagined them as stories not spoken, just drawn. He realized he didn't need the names, not yet. He needed to learn how the light moved. The sky became less mysterious and more like a map carved into memory, waiting to be felt, not just seen. The wind shifted on the fourth morning. It didn't whistle or rush. It returned in pieces, like fragments of conversation. First in the trees, then along the shore, then lifting the edge of a mat left unattended. Kale rose and said simply, "Time to leave. The wind is curious again." They departed with little ceremony. The islanders waved, but without fuss. Tanoa's hands found their place on the ropes quickly. The sail lifted, not sharply but as if waking, and the canoe glided forward. Kale stood near the front, silent as always, his hands resting lightly on the frame. Tanoa watched the man's fingers. They weren't gripping anything, just resting, listening. As the island receded, the stars returned to view, the familiar ones. The ones Tanoa had begun to sketch in the air with his hands. And new ones, too. Or rather, old ones he hadn't noticed. As the sky darkened, Kaylee gestured toward a narrow streak of 3 faint lights. "We used to call that the broken shell." Tanoa's brow furrowed. "But it's too straight to be broken." "Exactly," Kale said. "That's why we forgot the name. It didn't feel right, but the shell was never broken, just misnamed." The canoe moved smoothly through the evening sea. Waves rose in long, shallow breaths, the kind that took many heartbeats to form and just as many to fall away. Tanoa lay back near the stern, staring up. The stars seemed closer now, not brighter, just nearer, as if they no longer needed permission to be seen. He heard Kale's voice again. "The wind is not just something we chase. It chases us. It listens. It remembers. When you stand still, it comes back to tell you what it heard." Tanoa closed his eyes. The wind brushed against his cheeks, warm and familiar, not pushing, not pulling, just present. He imagined it circling the canoe, tracing the edge of the sail, dipping into the crevices of the hull, storing the story of their voyage in its invisible threads. At some point in the night, Kale tapped him awake and handed him a small coconut bowl filled with cool, sweet water. Tanoa drank and handed it back. "You'll navigate tomorrow," Kayla said. Tanoa blinked, confused. "I don't know how." "You do. You just haven't spoken it yet." Tanoa looked up at the stars, then down at the water. "What if I forget where we're going?" Kale shrugged. "Then the wind will remind you." They said no more that night. The next morning, Tanoa stood near the mast, gripping the side of the hull, his eyes fixed ahead. He didn't speak. He just watched. He watched how the sail bent, how the waves curved, how the clouds floated low in one part of the sky and high in another. He placed his hand near the rim of the canoe, feeling the coolness of the breeze, the faint salt crust forming on his fingertips. He waited. Then he pointed, slightly, subtly, to the east of their path. Kale nodded. The canoe shifted. No words were spoken. The others didn't ask who was guiding. They didn't need to. They moved as one, not because of tradition, but because the silence told them enough. Tanoa didn't feel triumphant. He felt quiet, anchored, Not because he had discovered something, but because he had remembered something that was already there. He would not name stars just yet. He would not chant. He would not draw in sand, but he would remember the way the breadfruit dried unevenly, the way the trees drank wind, the way stars were not stolen, but misplaced, and now slowly, one by one, found again. The sea was calm, stretched like beaten copper beneath the morning light. The canoe moved gently, each paddle stroke silent except for the soft ripple that followed behind. Tanoa sat near the center, his hands resting on the edge of the hull, fingers trailing through the water. He had not spoken since dawn. It wasn't necessary. The ocean was speaking in low tones, currents and breezes, subtle shifts in texture and scent that told him more than words could. Kale sat cross-legged near the mast, shaping a coil of rope with slow, steady hands. He didn't look at Tanoa, but his quiet presence was heavy with attention. There was no formal instruction today, no questions or corrections, only observation. Learning now came from the sea itself, and from how one listened to its rhythms. Ahead, clouds formed a thin wall along the horizon, not thick enough for rain, not dark enough to warn, but just enough to change the way the sky met the water. Tanoa noticed how the light played against it. He pointed, not directly at the cloud bank, but just to the left of it. The older boys shifted without question. The sail was adjusted. The canoe turned. A small seabird flew parallel to them for a while, skimming low over the waves. Kale finally broke his silence. That one doesn't migrate. It nests near islands. If it's out this far, it's because we're between two land shadows. Tanoa watched the bird. Its wings barely moved, using wind alone to glide forward. It seemed to know where it was going. He turned his attention to the sky. The familiar shapes of constellations were faint now, blurred by the arrival of day, but the arrangement remained. One bright point above the broken shell formation, one low cluster near the edge of the invisible reef they had passed hours earlier. These were the markers Kale spoke of. Shapes, not names. Stories, not labels. Later in the day, Kale motioned to the water. Look at the wave layers. Tanoa leaned over, careful not to disturb the balance of the vessel. 2 sets, he murmured. Kale nodded. One comes from the east, the other rides underneath it. That one comes from the southeast. Tanoa tilted his head. So which one do we follow? Kale smiled slightly. The one that listens when we speak. It took Tanoa a moment to understand. The waves, like the wind, responded, not in the way of people, but in subtle physical shifts. If the canoe moved at odds with the dominant swell, it slowed, resisted. If it followed the undercurrent, it moved easier, so they adjusted, quietly, without announcement. By evening, the water darkened and the sky softened. The air was cooler now, and the wind had changed tone, whispering instead of humming. Tanoa helped lower the sail slightly and tied off the main line with a knot he had practiced many times but rarely used. It held firm. They dropped anchor near a submerged sandbar, barely visible beneath the glassy surface. It would be their resting point for the night. Not land, but stillness. Kale took his place near the stern. The others drifted into quiet sleep one by one. Tanoa remained awake. He lay on his back, watching stars return. Not all of them. Just the ones who showed up early, blinking into place like old friends returning from absence. He whispered the shapes to himself. Canoe spine, slanted mast, jagged horizon, the forgotten cross. None of these were their names, but the names would come later. He was learning to see first. Kale spoke softly from the darkness. The first time I navigated, I was wrong. Tanoa turned his head. What happened? I followed the shape I was taught, but I placed it in the wrong part of the sky. We drifted 2 days before the wind forgave me. Tanoa considered this. Did they punish you? Kale shook his head. They waited. They knew the sea would teach what they couldn't. There was a long pause. Is that why you don't speak much? Kale smiled faintly in the dark. Words make things harder sometimes. The wind doesn't speak in sentences, neither should we. Tanoa nodded, though Kaylee couldn't see it. He watched the stars for a while longer. Then, for the first time, he closed his eyes and slept on the water without fear. The next morning, a pod of dolphins followed them. Tanoa took it as a good sign, though Kaylee didn't comment. Instead, they adjusted course again, not toward any specific shape or island, but in response to a change in the wind's touch. It had grown heavier, more insistent. The canoe moved faster now. By midday, clouds gathered again. These were not the soft, high clouds of the morning, but low ones, thick with moisture, slow-moving. Rain would come soon, but not with violence. It would come with patience. Kale handed Tanoa a flat piece of shell. "Watch for reflection," he said. Tanoa held it near his face, angling it toward the sky. He saw the clouds in it, but also something more. Movement, a glint of brightness behind the gray, the suggestion of light trying to break through. He didn't understand what to make of it, Kale explained. When the water reflects brighter than the sky, land is near. Not close, but near. Tanoa understood then. The ocean remembered land, even when it wasn't visible. It carried the shape of it, reflected it upward, passed the memory of it to whoever had the eyes to see. He held the shell again, tilting it slowly. A soft glow shone from a spot low on the horizon, east-southeast. They changed course once more. That night the rain came, gentle but steady. They kept sailing. Kale covered the sail partially to avoid gathering too much wind. The others huddled beneath mats and canvas, sharing space, sharing warmth. Tanoa sat upright, watching the water as it gathered on the hull, as it streamed into the sea and became part of it again. The stars were hidden. There was no sky to speak of, only blackness above, blackness below, and the feel of the canoe beneath his legs, moving forward without obvious direction. Yet it didn't feel lost. It felt certain. Tanoa closed his eyes and let the wind press softly against his skin. He raised a hand, fingers spread. The rain passed between them like threads. He whispered no names, only shapes, only memory. Kaylee's voice came again, this time quieter. The ones who remember without speaking, those are the ones who guide even in a storm. And just like that, the rain began to fade. The morning after the rain carried a strange silence. Not the usual soft quiet of drifting canoe wood or rustling palm fronds on distant shores, but a heavier kind, like the ocean itself was waiting. The clouds had cleared, but not completely. A silver haze hung low over the water, diffusing the light so that the sun looked like it had been wrapped in cloth. Tanoa sat near the bow, cradling a dried gourd half full with drinking water. His palms, raw from the rope, rested lightly on its smooth surface. Kale didn't say much. He hadn't since the rain ended. Instead, he moved through the boat with slow, deliberate precision, checking each line, adjusting the tautness of each knot. He touched the hulls, the sail, the basket holding dried breadfruit, as if all of them held stories that had not yet been spoken aloud. Tanoa mimicked his movements where he could, wiping salt residue from the wood with a woven leaf sponge, checking for soft spots in the rope. The canoe was holding strong, but something in the sky still felt unsettled. The older boys whispered among themselves about direction. Some of them pointed toward what they thought was the outline of an island in the far distance, low, flat, and gray. Kale shook his head. "Mirage," he said. "You see what you're ready to see, not what's there." Tanoa narrowed his eyes. He thought he saw land, too, but Kale's voice was firm enough to override doubt or belief, so he focused instead on the waves. They had changed since yesterday. No longer steady in one direction, they seemed to crisscross, two patterns overlaid. The surface of the ocean looked restless, though the canoe itself remained steady. It was as if the sea below was arguing with itself about where to go next. Kale gathered the apprentices near the center of the canoe. "We're in a convergence," he said. Two currents are meeting here. One is stronger, but the other is deeper. You need to feel both. Tanoa sat quietly, letting the movement of the canoe press against his bones. The sway was no longer predictable. There were tiny lurches in rhythm, sudden stalls, and tilts that lasted longer than expected. He braced himself, not with hands or knees, but with attention. He leaned ever so slightly into the motion, allowing his body to match it. "Don't fight it," Kayla murmured. "It's not trying to throw you. It's trying to teach you how to listen." For the next few hours, they drifted. No paddling, no adjustments, just observation. Tanoa thought about that for a long time. If stars stayed still and only the ocean moved, then the sky became a mirror, not of the sea, but of the Voyager's mind. The next day, land appeared. Not as a mirage this time. It grew slowly on the horizon, becoming more defined with each breath of wind. Trees, steep cliffs, and a wide inlet revealed themselves in patient order. No one spoke until the canoe grounded softly against the shore. They had arrived at an uninhabited island used only for storage and weather study, an old site once visited by navigators centuries ago, abandoned now except for a few coconut palms and a stone fire ring. The apprentices stepped out carefully, feet touching the ground with hesitation, as if it might slip away. Kale walked inland, Tanoa following. Near the center of the island, under a thick grove of breadfruit trees, they found a half-collapsed shelter. Kale lifted a mat of palm fronds and revealed a cache of old tools, gourds, a fishing net, and something else. A flat, polished stone with carvings. He handed it to Tanoa. The boy turned it over in his hands. The lines were faint, faded from age, but clear. Shapes, curves, small star clusters arranged not as names but as paths. Kale knelt beside him. "This is from the last generation that named stars without fear." Tanoa felt his fingers tremble slightly. Why did they stop? Kale's eyes were steady. Because naming is power, and power was once misused. They spent the night on the island. No fire, just wind and stars. And in the hush between sleep and waking, Tanoa whispered new names for the stars, softly, not to own them, but to remember. The following morning began without announcement. No wind, no swell, just the sound of insects from the interior of the small island and the quiet rustle of dry fronds along the tree line. Tanoa sat with the flat, carved stone in his lap, still trying to decipher the faint patterns etched across its surface. There were curves where he expected lines, arcs where his training had placed corners. This was not a star chart in the sense he had been taught. It was a memory in stone, shaped not by precision, but by rhythm. Kale approached with 2 gourds of fresh water and placed one beside Tanoa without saying anything. He crouched, resting his weight lightly on the balls of his feet, and looked down at the stone. "That pattern," he said after a moment, "is not meant to be looked at with your eyes." Tanoa frowned. "Then how?" "With your hands, with motion." Kale reached out, traced his finger slowly along one curve, then he doubled back, reversing direction, following a spiral inward. Tanoa watched carefully. It wasn't like reading. It was more like walking through a remembered place, one you hadn't visited in years, but still knew the path through by instinct. Each line Kale touched seemed to bring with it a memory, a wind direction, a sea temperature, the call of a bird. "Every curve is a wind shift," Kale said. "Every notch is a reef. This stone isn't a map of where to go. It's a map of what the sea becomes when you go there." Tanoa took the stone again. He closed his eyes, let his finger follow the carved grooves. He didn't know the meaning of what he felt, but he felt something, and that was enough to keep him quiet for a long time. That afternoon, they explored more of the island. It was not large, barely more than a rise of sand and volcanic rock with trees clustering at the center. The northern edge held signs of previous visits, old shell middens, burnt coconut husks, a stretch of smoothed rock where nets might have once been dried. Tanoa wandered ahead, finding a narrow path winding up the central ridge. At the top, the view opened, unobstructed, with a clear shot of the ocean in every direction. He called down to Kaylee, who climbed slowly behind him. Together, they sat at the peak, looking out. "Do you see that line?" Kale asked, pointing westward. Tanoa nodded. "Where the water changes color?" "Yes, that's a current edge. Two water bodies touching, not mixing. Like people who speak the same language but follow different gods." Tanoa looked longer. He saw how the sea shimmered differently on each side of that invisible border. One side was darker, slower. The other seemed brighter, more restless. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to sail across that divide. "We used to train only on those lines," Kale said. "We'd sail back and forth, testing how the canoe moved under each current. It taught us how small changes changed everything." They camped again that night, preparing to leave at first light. Tanoa didn't sleep much. He spent hours running his fingers over the stone again and again, feeling his way through its story. When he closed his eyes, the grooves became the ocean itself, shifting, pulling, breathing. Not a barrier to be crossed, but a long conversation you had to listen to in silence. The next day, as they departed, the wind returned, not sharp or sudden, but purposeful. It moved across the hull like a hand brushing grain into a basket, intentional and even. The canoe pulled forward easily, the sail rising full but not taut. They passed the current divide quickly. Tanoa could feel it even without Kale's guidance. The canoe rocked differently. The paddles sounded hollow for 3 strokes, then full again, and the air smelled slightly saltier, less of island, more of distance. Kale let Tanoa guide for a while. No words, just the slow turn of the canoe in response to fingertip pressure on the tiller. Tanoa didn't choose a star this time. He chose a feeling, one that matched the stone's spiral, a sensation of leaning right, then left, then straight again. He didn't name the direction. He didn't need to. Later, they caught sight of another canoe, distant, almost lost in haze. It was headed in a similar direction but followed a different course, angled slightly north. Kale watched it silently, then said, "They're following a different memory." Tanoa watched the other vessel disappear behind a mist bank. He wondered if its crew knew about the carved stone, if they were also tracing shapes with their hands instead of eyes. That evening, they anchored in open water. No land in sight, only stars above and sea beneath. Kaylee brought out a gourd of fermented breadfruit and passed it around. The apprentices were tired, but calm. Something had settled in them during the journey, less uncertainty, more rhythm. Tanoa leaned back, arms folded beneath his head, and stared at the sky. He saw a new pattern tonight, a cluster of 5 stars shaped like a hook. He hadn't seen it before, though he must have passed under it many times. He raised a hand and traced the curve in the air. Kale, watching him, said softly, "That one was once called the fisherman's bent arm." Tanoa nodded. "It looks strong." Kale's face was unreadable. "The story says the arm was broken, not bent, but the star never stopped pulling fish." They were quiet again. That night, Tanoa dreamed of canoes moving across invisible lines. Each one left a different wake. Some vanished, some turned in circles, but a few, only a few, left trails of light behind them, as if marking the ocean with memory. When he woke, the sky was overcast, the sea slow. Kale gave him the tiller without a word. It was time for Tanoa to guide again. The canoe moved through waters that no longer whispered, but hummed. The deeper currents below seemed slower now, like the entire sea was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Tanoa stood near the stern, not in control, but close to the tiller, where Kaylee could easily correct him if needed. Yet for most of the morning, Kale said nothing. The silence between them was no longer one of caution or instruction. It was a silence of agreement. of having passed through some invisible threshold of learning that didn't need words to be marked. Tanoa scanned the horizon in slow, even motions. His eyes didn't dart or fixate. They floated, like driftwood on the surface, rising and falling with the rhythm of observation. Clouds were sparse today, thin and high. The sun burned against the curve of the sail, but the wind kept it manageable. They were moving west by northwest, according to the pull of the water against the hull and the lean of the paddle wake. But Tanoa wasn't thinking about compass points. He was thinking about memory. Kale had once said the sea forgets nothing, only hides. Now, as the canoe cut through long channels of darker water, Tanoa wondered how much of the sea's remembering was lost, simply because no one had known how to ask. He had begun to notice things, small things, the shift in the scent of salt, the soft percussion of bubbles when a fish school passed below, the tone of the canoe's wooden body when a wave hit it at just the right angle. All these were signals, quiet cues, things that had always been there. Midday passed in a stretch of stillness. The sea flattened again, but in a different way. Not the silence of calm, but the poised quiet before a decision. Kale adjusted a line on the mast and gave a short nod to Tanoa. The direction was fine. They would keep it. A small, thin bird, white with a narrow beak and angular wings, landed briefly on the edge of the canoe. It didn't seem to care about the people or the motion. It stood on the rope coil near the water jar, preening itself without urgency. Tanoa watched it. The bird looked unremarkable, but Kale said softly, "Storm petrel." Tanoa turned to him. "A storm is coming?" "No," Kale replied. "It left one behind. This bird follows calm now." The bird stayed for less than an hour, then took off, straight west, disappearing into a strip of sky that looked slightly deeper in color. Tanoa watched the point where it vanished for a long time. By evening, the stars came out slowly, like the memory of a chant returning after years of silence. Tanoa recognized the crooked line of the canoe spine and the slant of the fisherman's arm. He traced them with his hand. Then behind him, one of the older boys pointed to a star low on the southern horizon. "That one wasn't there last night," the boy said. Kale nodded. "It's not a new star, just one we haven't visited in a while." Tanoa turned. It wasn't bright, but it was distinct. A lone light, slightly red in hue, almost pulsing. Kale said, "That's the reminder. It only appears when the moon wanes and the air has shifted. It marks the turning point." Tanoa watched it, breathing slowly. Turning toward what? Kale's eyes were fixed on the horizon. Home, maybe, or something we lost. They sailed through the night, not speaking. The wind carried them forward in short, focused bursts. The stars shifted slightly above them. And in the pauses between gusts, Tanoa began to hear something beneath the water. Soft clicks, like stone tapping stone. He leaned over the hull. Nothing visible, just sound. Kale, without turning, said, "That's reef speech. We're nearing shallow water. There's a line of coral beneath us, long and narrow, like a finger pointing." Tanoa didn't ask what it pointed to. He waited, and when the clicks grew louder, they adjusted course slightly. The canoe drifted left, skimming the edge of the reef with care. By sunrise, the water had warmed again. The sun came up fast and hard, burning the mist away. On the horizon, a shape emerged. Not an island, but the outline of a submerged plateau. Sea plants danced in the shallows. Fish glinted just beneath the surface. Kale signaled to anchor. They stopped there, drifting gently over the coral. Kale called everyone to the center of the canoe. He unwrapped a tightly bundled mat from beneath the supply crate and opened it slowly. Inside was a single object, a dried piece of breadfruit, wrapped in cloth marked with faint ink. "This," he said, "is from the first voyage I took as a boy." Tanoa leaned in. The breadfruit was hard, fossil-like, its edges cracked and flaking, but something about it felt permanent. It had survived. Storms, sun, forgetting. Kale held it up. Every time I think I've forgotten the route, I remember this. It holds the taste of the old wind. Tanoa reached for it, but stopped. Can I? Kale nodded. Tanoa touched the breadfruit. It was lighter than he expected. He closed his eyes. It smelled of salt and dust, but faintly, beneath that, something sweet, a ghost of flavor. He imagined biting into it and tasting not fruit, but the memory of the voyage itself. They passed it hand to hand, the others holding it with reverence. Then Kale wrapped it again and placed it back beneath the crate. The day grew warmer. The sea shimmered. They remained anchored over the reef, letting the canoe rest. Kale said they would wait here for the moon's shift. The stars above us tonight will not be the same, he said. We need to let the sky finish its breath before we move. Tanoa lay back and stared upward. He felt something inside him beginning to align, not like knowledge, but like rhythm, as though he had started to pulse in time with something larger. That night the stars returned as Kale said they would, different, rearranged, new openings in old patterns. Tanoa saw the reminder again, now higher. He saw the hook, curved more tightly, and he saw a small triangle of lights he hadn't noticed before, near the edge of the eastern cloud belt. He pointed to it. Kale followed his gaze. That, he said, was once called the bowl. It held everything we feared might spill. Tanoa stared. Did it? Kaylee's face was quiet. Sometimes, but we kept sailing anyway. The canoe rocked gently beneath the moonless sky. No stars yet, no breeze to stir the sail, just the hush of night and the subtle shift of salt air. Tanoa sat cross-legged near the front, elbows resting on his knees, eyes closed. Around him, the other apprentices whispered softly, but their voices faded easily into the vastness of the sea. It had been a day of stillness, and the night carried that stillness forward, like breath held between two long chants. Kale sat near the tiller, sharpening a piece of bone with practiced, rhythmic motion. The scrape of bone against stone was soft, deliberate, more meditation than task. Tanoa had watched him do this before, but tonight, there was something different in Kale's posture, something more inward. He seemed to be listening not to the sea, but to memory. Earlier that afternoon, they had passed the reef edge and entered an area where the water turned an unusual shade of gray-blue, almost like the sky itself had sunk into it. Kale called this the blank place, a stretch of ocean where the currents moved less predictably, where few birds flew and even fish were scarce. It wasn't dangerous, but it asked for care. It was a place between places, he'd said, a gap in the map that one had to feel their way across rather than navigate. Tanoa had felt it too, a thin unease that made the silence seem heavier. The waves still rolled beneath them, but they lacked the musicality of the open sea. They weren't singing now, they were waiting. As evening deepened, Kale finally spoke. Tonight you'll take first watch. Tanoa nodded, not surprised. He'd done it once before, but that had been near shore, with stars overhead. Here, surrounded by blankness, it felt more like being left alone in a story that had forgotten its ending. He stood and walked carefully toward the stern. Kale handed him the tiller, then stepped back, folding his arms and closing his eyes. You don't have to move it, Kale said. Just hold it. Listen. Tanoa wrapped his fingers around the smooth wood. It felt cool and slightly damp, as though it too was awake. The canoe barely drifted now. The water had lost its push. They floated like memory, still, suspended. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time became flat. Tanoa watched the sky shift slowly from silver to black, and the first stars emerged, scattered, uncertain. Not the familiar groupings from previous nights, but smaller points, dim and flickering. He tried to find the canoe spine, the fisherman's arm. Nothing aligned. A voice broke the silence. One of the apprentices, speaking in his sleep. Just a few syllables. Then quiet again. Tanoa glanced toward him, but didn't move. His hand tightened on the tiller. Kale's voice came low and steady. "You're drifting." Tanoa frowned. "I haven't moved." "But the water has." He looked down. The paddle line was taut. Barely, but enough. A change in current, a pull from beneath. He leaned slightly to the right, adjusting his weight, and the canoe shifted subtly, sliding into the flow rather than against it. Kale nodded once and said nothing more. Through the night, Tanoa remained still. The stars grew bolder, rearranging themselves overhead. He began to see patterns again. Not the same ones, but cousins to the old ones. New shapes forming from familiar pieces. When Kale returned, he didn't ask for a report. He simply stood beside Tanoa, hand resting on the tiller for a moment, then turned away. That was the new way, learning in silence. The next morning came gray and damp. Low mist hugged the water, erasing the horizon entirely. There was no sky, no sea, just a slow undulation of the canoe between layers of light and cloud. Kale gathered the group. "Today," he said, "we'll sail without seeing." Tanoa looked at him. "No stars, no sun, no wind." Kale nodded. "And still we'll move." They raised the sail anyway. Not high, but enough to catch what little motion the air gave. Kale placed Tanoa and another apprentice at opposite ends of the canoe and asked them to describe what they felt. Not saw, not thought, but felt. "The wind hits my neck, then wraps around my left side," Tanoa said after a moment. "I feel it pushing straight down the center," said the other. Kaylee turned the canoe slightly, just a hand's width of adjustment. The sail shifted, the rope lines tugged. The canoe began to move, not fast, but with intent. "That's how we steer when there's nothing to see," Kale said. "With bodies, with skin." The day passed slowly. They took turns resting, keeping watch, listening. Small sounds began to emerge again. Distant bird calls, the soft slap of fishtails on the surface, the creak of hull against outrigger. The sea, it seemed, had grown curious again. In the afternoon, the mist broke in pieces. Slivers of sunlight struck the water like spears. Then, near the western edge, the mist peeled back to reveal a thin, dark line. Tanoa pointed. "Land!" Kale shook his head. "Not yet. A shoal." The water shallowed. The sea turned bright blue again, the color of memory. Tanoa leaned over and saw the shadow of the coral, long and branching. Fish darted below. The sea had awakened. Kale allowed them to stop there, letting down anchor in a patch of calm near the shoal. They rested on the canoe, eating cold, dried taro and small salted fish. The sea spoke in small syllables again, gentle, relaxed. Tanoa held the old carved stone in his hands once more. He traced a path on it, not from memory, but from instinct. His finger followed a groove that spiraled outward, then back in again. He recognized the shape. It was the movement they had just made, the great arc around silence, the tilt into windless water, the emergence into clarity. Kale saw him tracing and said, "You're beginning to read." "I'm not sure what it says," Tanoa replied. "It doesn't say, it shows." Tanoa understood then. The sea did not explain, it revealed. As the sun dipped behind the shoal, the stars returned once again, and Tanoa found them. Not all, but enough. The fisherman's arm was back. The reminder hung just above the horizon, and a new star, pale and sharp, blinked once from a gap in the clouds. Kaylee said softly, "That's the Voyager's eye. It appears only after a night of silence." Tanoa stared at it. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. The canoe rocked gently beneath the moonless sky. No stars yet, no breeze to stir the sail, just the hush of night and the subtle shift of salt air. Tanoa sat cross-legged near the front, elbows resting on his knees, eyes closed. Around him, the other apprentices whispered softly, but their voices faded easily into the vastness of the sea. It had been a day of stillness, and the night carried that stillness forward, like breath held between two long chants. Kale sat near the tiller, sharpening a piece of bone with practiced, rhythmic motion. The scrape of bone against stone was soft, deliberate, more meditation than task. Tanoa had watched him do this before. But tonight, there was something different in Kale's posture, something more inward. He seemed to be listening not to the sea, but to memory. Earlier that afternoon, they had passed the reef edge and entered an area where the water turned an unusual shade of gray-blue, almost like the sky itself had sunk into it. Kale called this the blank place, a stretch of ocean where the currents moved less predictably, where few birds flew and even fish were scarce. It wasn't dangerous, but it asked for care. It was a place between places, he'd said. A gap in the map that one had to feel their way across rather than navigate. Tanoa had felt it too, a thin unease that made the silence seem heavier. The waves still rolled beneath them, but they lacked the musicality of the open sea. They weren't singing now, they were waiting. As evening deepened, Kale finally spoke. "Tonight you'll take first watch." Tanoa nodded, not surprised. He'd done it once before, but that had been near shore, with stars overhead. Here, surrounded by blankness, it felt more like being left alone in a story that had forgotten its ending. He stood and walked carefully toward the stern. Kale handed him the tiller, then stepped back, folding his arms and closing his eyes. "You don't have to move it," Kale said. "Just hold it. Listen." Tanoa wrapped his fingers around the smooth wood. It felt cool and slightly damp, as though it too was awake. The canoe barely drifted now. The water had lost its push. They floated like memory, still, suspended. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time became flat. Tanoa watched the sky shift slowly from silver to black, and the first stars emerged, scattered, uncertain. Not the familiar groupings from previous nights, but smaller points, dim and flickering. He tried to find the canoe spine, the fisherman's arm. Nothing aligned. A voice broke the silence, one of the apprentices speaking in his sleep. Just a few syllables, then quiet again. Tanoa glanced toward him but didn't move. His hand tightened on the tiller. Kale's voice came low and steady. "You're drifting." Tanoa frowned. "I haven't moved, but the water has." He looked down. The paddle line was taut, barely, but enough. A change in current, a pull from beneath. He leaned slightly to the right, adjusting his weight, and the canoe shifted subtly, sliding into the flow rather than against it. Kale nodded once and said nothing more. Through the night, Tanoa remained still. The stars grew bolder, rearranging themselves overhead. He began to see patterns again. Not the same ones, but cousins to the old ones. New shapes forming from familiar pieces. When Kale returned, he didn't ask for a report. He simply stood beside Tanoa, hand resting on the tiller for a moment, then turned away. That was the new way, learning in silence. The next morning came gray and damp. Low mist hugged the water, erasing the horizon entirely. There was no sky, no sea, just a slow undulation of the canoe between layers of light and cloud. Kale gathered the group. "Today," he said, "we'll sail without seeing." Tanoa looked at him. "No stars, no sun, no wind." Kale nodded. "And still, we'll move." They raised the sail anyway. Not high, but enough to catch what little motion the air gave. Kale placed Tanoa and another apprentice at opposite ends of the canoe and asked them to describe what they felt. Not saw, not thought, but felt. "The wind hits my neck, then wraps around my left side," Tanoa said after a moment. "I feel it pushing straight down the center," said the other. Kale turned the canoe slightly, just a hand's width of adjustment. The sail shifted, the rope lines tugged. The canoe began to move, not fast, but with intent. "That's how we steer when there's nothing to see," Kale said. "With bodies, with skin." The day passed slowly. They took turns resting, keeping watch, listening. Small sounds began to emerge again. Distant bird calls, the soft slap of fishtails on the surface, the creak of hull against outrigger. The sea, it seemed, had grown curious again. In the afternoon, the mist broke in pieces. Slivers of sunlight struck the water like spears. Then, near the western edge, the mist peeled back to reveal a thin, dark line. Tanoa pointed. Land? Kale shook his head. Not yet. A shoal. The water shallowed. The sea turned bright blue again, the color of memory. Tanoa leaned over and saw the shadow of the coral, long and branching. Fish darted below. The sea had awakened. Kale allowed them to stop there, letting down anchor in a patch of calm near the shoal. They rested on the canoe, eating cold, dried taro and small salted fish. The sea spoke in small syllables again, gentle, relaxed. Tanoa held the old carved stone in his hands once more. He traced a path on it, not from memory but from instinct. His finger followed a groove that spiraled outward, then back in again. He recognized the shape. It was the movement they had just made, the great arc around silence, the tilt into windless water, the emergence into clarity. Kale saw him tracing and said, "You're beginning to read." "I'm not sure what it says," Tanoa replied. "It doesn't say, it shows." Tanoa understood then. The sea did not explain. It was revealed. As the sun dipped behind the shoal, the stars returned once again, and Tanoa found them, not all, but enough. The fisherman's arm was back. The reminder hung just above the horizon, and a new star, pale and sharp, blinked once from a gap in the clouds. Kaylee said softly, "That's the Voyager's eye. It appears only after a night of silence." Tanoa stared at it. He didn't speak. He simply nodded. The dawn was slow to break, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet hold of the night. The horizon remained blurred beneath a thick veil of mist that seemed to float above the water without dissolving. Tanoa stood at the prow, feeling the cool moisture settle on his skin, the salty tang of the sea mingling with the faint earthiness of the damp air. The canoe drifted steadily, the outrigger gently cutting through the calm surface, sending ripples outward that shimmered faintly in the weak light. The voyage had reached a new stage. The lessons of navigation had shifted from the concrete, stars, waves, birds, to the subtle and often overlooked, smells, sounds, and memories embedded in the sea itself. Tanoa's senses had sharpened, not to detect what was plainly visible, but what lingered just beyond perception. The faintest scent of rain on the wind, the change in salt concentration in the water, the pattern of bird calls that seemed to dance on the edge of hearing, all these now played into the unwritten map he was beginning to understand. Kale remained quiet, his presence steady and unyielding. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades listening to the sea's secrets. When he spoke, his voice was calm but purposeful, never rushed or loud. "This part of the ocean," he said one morning, "holds stories older than our people. The water remembers the passage of time differently here. We must be patient." Tanoa listened, sensing that patience was the key not just to navigation, but to survival itself. The sea was a teacher who offered lessons in whispers rather than commands. On this particular morning, the mist began to thin just enough to reveal faint outlines on the horizon, low islands cloaked in dense forest, their jagged peaks barely visible. The sight brought a quiet thrill to the group, but Kale warned restraint. Not all that appears is safe or familiar. Approach with respect and caution. As the canoe drew nearer, Tanoa observed the signs of the island's life. The cries of seabirds echoed above, sharp and insistent, while beneath the water, schools of fish flickered in shimmering schools. The tide shifted, and with it, the texture of the water changed. Smooth here, choppy there, currents weaving invisible threads. Each of these details became coordinates in an invisible map etched into Tanoa's memory. His body responded instinctively to the subtle changes. The direction of the wind, the way the canoe tilted, the faintest swell beneath his feet. At midday, the group anchored near a sheltered cove where the water glowed with an unusual clarity. Kale instructed the apprentices to gather fresh water from a nearby stream, a task that required careful timing to avoid the salty intrusion of the tide. The ritual was slow and deliberate, part necessity and part teaching. While some gathered water, others explored the rocky shore, collecting shells and driftwood. Tanoa watched the way Kale moved through the landscape, touching leaves gently, pausing to listen to distant sounds, reading the environment as one might read a book. The island was alive with unseen signals, and the older man's skill in deciphering them seemed almost effortless. As afternoon approached, a sudden shift in the wind brought a fresh scent, a hint of rain mixed with the deep aroma of damp earth. Kale called everyone back to the canoe. "The sky is changing. We must be ready." Tanoa felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. The sea's moods could turn quickly, and knowing how to respond was crucial. The canoe was readied, sails adjusted, ropes checked. The apprentices moved with quiet efficiency, each aware of the delicate balance between preparation and patience. When the first drops of rain fell, they were welcomed, cool and cleansing. But the storm did not come immediately. Instead, the sky darkened slowly, shadows lengthening, clouds gathering into thick, roiling masses. Tanoa sat by the canoe's edge, watching the interplay of light and shadow. He thought about the stories Kale had told, of voyages made long before their time, of navigators who trusted in signs no one else could see. The sea was full of such stories, whispered through generations. As the storm gathered strength, the wind rose sharply, filling the sails and pushing the canoe forward. Waves grew taller, their crests breaking with white foam that sparkled briefly in the fading light. The apprentices braced themselves, hands gripping the sides of the canoe, bodies leaning into the motion. Despite the storm's force, there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that spoke of order within chaos. Tanoa found himself moving in time with the sea, anticipating each swell and dip. The lessons of the journey coalesced in moments like this, where fear and mastery walked hand in hand. Night fell quickly. The storm's fury began to subside, leaving behind a sky scattered with stars once more. Tanoa's gaze lifted to the familiar constellations, the fisherman's arm, the reminder, the Voyager's eye. They shone steady and true, guiding lights after the tumult. Yet the voyage was far from over. Ahead lay more unknown waters, more lessons in listening and learning. Tanoa realized that the sea was not merely a place to cross, but a living chronicle, a memory held in waves and wind and rain and stars. What would the next dawn bring? Would the stars align as they had before, or would the sea demand a new kind of reading, a deeper trust in the unseen? The night held its secrets close, leaving Tanoa with questions that would only be answered by the journey itself. The early morning light filtered through thin layers of mist, casting a soft silver glow over the sea. The air was cool and still, holding a fragile quiet that felt almost sacred. Tanoa stood near the bow of the canoe, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where water met sky in a gentle, unbroken line. Around him, the other apprentices stirred awake, their movements slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile calm that enveloped them. Kale was already awake, moving quietly along the deck, checking the ropes and adjusting the sail with practiced hands. His eyes held the deep calm of one who understood the sea, not just as a force, but as a living companion, sometimes generous, sometimes unforgiving, but always honest. The lessons of navigation, Tanoa thought, were lessons in respect and humility. The previous night's storm had passed without incident, but its presence lingered in the coolness of the air and the slight roughness of the waves. The sea had shifted in temperament, and so had they. No longer was the journey just about reaching a destination. It was about listening, interpreting, and becoming part of a vast, interconnected rhythm. Kale gathered the apprentices for a morning talk. His voice was low, steady, a quiet beacon amidst the waking world. "The sea," he began, "is a storyteller. It tells us who we are and where we come from. But to understand its story, we must listen beyond the obvious. The stars are guides, yes, but the wind, the water, and even the scent of the air carry tales that no star can tell. Tanoa listened closely. His own senses felt heightened, each smell, each sound carrying new meaning. He had learned to read the sea in a way that felt like translation, a conversion of the invisible into the known. Their course for the day was set toward a group of small islands, barely visible through the haze. Kale emphasized patience. These islands are old. Their shapes have shifted over time, and so have the paths to reach them. The stars help, but so do the memories of the elders and the stories etched into the waves. As they sailed, Tanoa reflected on the significance of memory in their navigation. It was not just personal, but collective, woven into the very fabric of their culture. The sea held these memories like a vast archive, and the navigators were its librarians. Throughout the morning, Kale guided them in exercises to sense the wind's direction without sight, to detect changes in the water's color and texture, and to listen for distant bird calls that marked the proximity of land. These were skills passed down through generations, refined not by charts or instruments, but by acute awareness and practice. At one point, Tanoa noticed a sudden drop in temperature. The air grew heavier, carrying a subtle hint of rain. He mentioned it to Kaylee, who nodded approvingly. "Good. The sea always tells us in advance. It's up to us to pay attention." The afternoon brought a gentle breeze that filled the sail and pushed the canoe steadily forward. The waves rose and fell in slow, rhythmic pulses, and Tanoa felt a deep connection to the movement, as if he were part of the water itself, flowing and bending with its will. They paused briefly near a small atoll, where the water was crystal clear, revealing a vibrant underwater world. Tanoa peered over the side, watching fish dart through coral gardens, their scales catching the light like scattered jewels. The scene was a reminder of the delicate balance they navigated, not just between islands, but within ecosystems that had sustained generations. Kale spoke of stewardship and respect, reminding them that their journey was not just about crossing water, but about honoring the places and creatures that made the sea alive. "We travel with the sea's permission," he said. "It gives and takes in equal measure." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the sky ignited in soft hues of pink and gold. Tanoa felt the weight of the day's lessons settle within him, a quiet strength built on attentiveness and humility. The night brought another clear sky, stars scattered like grains of sand across a velvet cloth. Kale invited Tanoa to the stern for a special task, the reading of the night sky. Together, they traced the outlines of familiar constellations, but also noted subtle shifts, the movement of stars that marked seasons and changed the paths of voyagers. Kale shared stories of ancestral navigators who had relied on these shifting patterns to guide their canoes across vast oceans. These were tales not of conquest, but of harmony, of finding one's place within the wider world. Tanoa felt a surge of awe. The stars were not just points of light, but chapters in an ongoing story, written across the ages by those who dared to listen. As the canoe glided beneath the night sky, Tanoa wondered about the journeys yet to come. How many stories lay hidden in the quiet spaces between waves? How many secrets waited in the smell of rain, the touch of wind, or the fading glimmer of a distant star? The sea remained silent, holding its mysteries close. And Tanoa knew that learning to navigate was also learning to live, with patience, with respect, and with a heart open to the subtle language of the world. The days had begun to blend into one another, each marked not by the clock or calendar, but by the shifting moods of the sea and sky. Tanoa had long since lost track of how many sunrises and sunsets had passed since they had left their home island. Yet within this timeless flow, every moment was rich with detail, every breath a note in the ongoing symphony of the voyage. Kale moved among the apprentices with quiet authority, guiding their hands, steadying their gaze, and encouraging their silence. The lessons now centered less on the visible and more on the felt, the subtle sensations that whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen. One morning, as mist clung low to the water's surface, Kale brought the group to a stop near a small cluster of rocky islets. The air was thick with the scent of seaweed and salt, and the water shimmered with the slow dance of currents that seemed almost deliberate in their rhythm. Kaylee instructed the apprentices to leave their instruments and charts behind. "Today," he said, "we travel by memory alone. Trust the sea, the sky, and the stories carried in your blood." Tanoa felt a shiver of anticipation mixed with a familiar nervousness. Navigation without tools meant surrendering to intuition, to the senses that had been honed through years of practice, but still demanded respect and humility. They launched the canoe once more, paddles dipping quietly into the dark water. The sky above was a canvas of soft gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. Visibility was low, and the familiar constellations were veiled by mist. Despite this, Kale's calm presence was a beacon. He moved with measured grace, reading the water's texture, the cadence of the waves, the distant calls of birds returning from unseen shores. Tanoa focused inward, feeling the rhythm of the canoe's movement and the way the wind brushed his skin. He tried to silence the chatter of doubt that occasionally surfaced. Questions about the reliability of memory, the unseen dangers of the sea, the uncertainty that accompanied every choice. Hours passed, marked by subtle shifts, the change in the swell, the faint smell of damp earth on the wind, the distant sound of breaking waves. These were the landmarks now, less visible but no less real. Mid-afternoon brought a sudden lift in the clouds, and with it, a burst of sunlight that revealed a distant island, its cliffs stark against the bright sky. The apprentices cheered softly, but Kale reminded them to maintain their focus. They approached cautiously, guided by the changing color of the water and the flight paths of birds circling overhead. The island was unfamiliar, its shape different from any on their charts, but the stories of their elders had prepared them to recognize the subtle signs. As they drew near, Tanoa spotted a series of narrow inlets, each guarded by jagged rocks and dense mangrove forests. Kale pointed to a sheltered bay framed by palms, signaling their landing spot. The landing itself was a careful maneuver. The canoe bumped gently against smooth stones, and the apprentices leapt onto shore, securing their vessel and gathering their belongings with practiced efficiency. The island was alive with the rustle of leaves and the calls of unseen creatures. Tanoa inhaled deeply, feeling the thick humidity press against his skin, mingling with the salty tang of the sea. The place was both strange and familiar, a puzzle piece in the larger map of their journey. Kale led them through a narrow trail lined with towering trees and vibrant orchids. The path wound upward, revealing glimpses of the sea through gaps in the canopy. The air was alive with the hum of insects and the distant crash of waves against rocky cliffs. At the summit, Kaylee paused and turned to the group. "Here," he said, "is where the sky meets the earth, where the stars and sea are one. Remember this place." They spent the night on the island, sleeping beneath the stars and listening to the chorus of nocturnal life. Tanoa lay awake for hours, pondering the day's lessons and the stories embedded in the land and sea. The following morning, they prepared to leave. Kale gathered the apprentices once more. "Our journey continues," he said softly. "But each step we take adds to the story, and each memory is a thread in the fabric of our people." As they set out again, Tanoa felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the sea or the islands, but to the generations of navigators who had come before him. Their knowledge was woven into his skin, carried in the rhythm of his breath and the beat of his heart. He wondered how many journeys like theirs had unfolded silently beneath these same stars, how many had succeeded, and how many had been lost to the sea's vast memory. In the quiet moments between paddling, Tanoa reflected on the nature of knowledge itself. Was it only what could be seen, measured, and recorded? Or did true understanding lie in the unseen? The feelings, the stories, the intuition that bound people to their environment in ways no chart could capture? As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the canoe sliced through gentle waves, carrying them onward. The stars began to emerge once more, guiding lights that had witnessed countless voyages. And Tanoa knew that the journey was not just about reaching a destination. It was about becoming part of a story much larger than himself, a story told in silence, in movement, and in the subtle dance between sea and sky. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a seamless ribbon where sea met sky in a quiet, unbroken embrace. The canoe glided steadily, its wooden hull cutting through the glassy surface with barely a sound. Around Tanoa, the world felt suspended in a timeless moment, the boundary between the known and the unknown, between past and future, between earth and sky. This final stretch of the voyage carried with it a weight that was almost palpable, not just because of the physical journey, but because of what it represented. After weeks of lessons in silence and patience, of learning to read the sea through senses sharpened by experience rather than sight alone, Tanoa found himself standing at a crossroads. The path forward was both literal and metaphorical, a test of everything he had absorbed. Kale's presence was steady beside him, a silent anchor amidst the subtle movements of the canoe and the shifting light. The elder's eyes reflected the depth of oceans, carrying stories too vast to be told in a single lifetime. He had shared fragments, passed down wisdom carved into waves and whispered by stars, but much remained unspoken, waiting for the journey to complete itself. The morning air was thick with the scent of salt and damp wood, mixed with the faint aroma of burning leaves from distant islands. The sky held the soft pink glow of dawn, a quiet promise of new beginnings and revelations. Tanoa breathed deeply, feeling the rhythm of the sea pulse beneath his feet and the steady beat of his own heart. Throughout the voyage, Tanoa had learned that navigation was less about control and more about surrender. Surrendering to the sea's moods, to the subtle shifts in wind and wave, to the silent language of the environment that required listening more than seeing. It was a dance of intuition and knowledge, memory and presence. As the canoe drifted closer to a cluster of islands barely visible on the horizon, Tanoa reflected on the moments that had defined this journey. The nights spent under skies heavy with stars and silence. The mornings when mist wrapped the world in a soft shroud, blurring the edges of reality and memory. The days when the sea held its breath, waiting to reveal its secrets to those patient enough to watch and listen. Kale's voice broke the reverie, quiet but firm. This is the place the stars have led us to. The final point on the map is drawn not in ink but in memory and breath. The islands loomed closer, their shapes sharp against the morning light. Waves whispered against rocky shores, and the cries of seabirds filled the air. Tanoa felt a surge of both anticipation and reverence. This was not just a destination, but a homecoming, a return to the roots of a tradition that had sustained their people for generations. They navigated carefully through narrow channels, the water shifting from deep blue to translucent turquoise. Coral reefs rose beneath the surface like hidden guardians, their intricate forms a testament to the ocean's resilience and mystery. Tanoa marveled at the fragile beauty, aware of the responsibility carried by those who traveled these waters. As they drew near a small bay sheltered by towering cliffs and swaying palms, Kale gestured for the canoe to slow. The group worked together to bring the vessel gently ashore, their movements practiced and harmonious. On land, the air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers, the sound of rustling leaves mingling with distant waves. The apprentices gathered their belongings and paused, taking in the moment, the culmination of a journey both physical and spiritual. Kale spoke again, his tone tinged with quiet pride. This is where our story continues. The lessons of the sea, the stars, and memory converge here, passed from one generation to the next. Tanoa felt the weight of those words settle deep within him. The journey had been more than a test of skill. It was an initiation into a lineage that transcended time and place. The knowledge carried by their elders was alive, a living thread woven through the fabric of their people. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the apprentices gathered around a fire. Stories were shared, some old, some new, told in voices soft and steady. The crackle of flames mingled with the hum of insects and the distant murmur of the sea. Tanoa listened, absorbing the narratives that linked past and present, weaving together lessons learned and dreams yet to be realized. The night sky unfolded above them, stars glittering in constellations that had guided voyagers for centuries. Kale pointed to familiar shapes, the fisherman's arm, the reminder, the voyager's eye, and spoke of their meanings, of the roles they played in navigation and in the stories that shaped their culture. Tanoa gazed upward, feeling a profound connection to those who had come before, to the vast ocean that had both challenged and nurtured them. The stars were more than guides. They were keepers of memory, silent witnesses to countless journeys across endless horizons. As the fire's glow dimmed and the night deepened, Tanoa reflected on the voyage's lessons: the patience to wait, the courage to trust, the humility to listen. The sea had taught him that true navigation was not simply about direction, but about harmony, with nature, with history, and with oneself. He realized that this journey was just one thread in a vast tapestry of human experience, one story among many that carried the weight of survival, resilience, and belonging. The techniques learned, the memories honored, and the bonds forged would ripple through time, shaping futures yet unseen. In the stillness before dawn, Tanoa closed his eyes and breathed in the cool air, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him, the steady heartbeat of the sea around him, and the light of distant stars above. He understood that the voyage was never truly over. It continued in every breath, every step, and every whispered story passed from one hand to the next. Story transition. The young voyager drifted farther than he planned, chasing stars he could barely follow, trusting instinct more than certainty. But not all guidance comes from above. Some knowledge waits beneath the surface, unseen, unspoken, but no less powerful. Now, we move toward another kind of knowing, where vision plays no part, and the ocean is understood not with the eyes, but through touch, rhythm, and memory. Let us listen to the waves, as they teach someone who cannot see, but I can feel everything, with history and with oneself. He realized that this journey was just one thread in a vast tapestry of human experience, one story among many that carried the weight of survival, resilience, and belonging. The techniques learned, the memories honored, and the bonds forged would ripple through time, shaping futures yet unseen. In the stillness before dawn, Tanoa closed his eyes and breathed in the cool air, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him, the steady heartbeat of the sea around him, and the light of distant stars above. He understood that the voyage was never truly over. It continued in every breath, every step, and every whispered story passed from one hand to the next. Story transition. The young voyager drifted farther than he planned, chasing stars he could barely follow, trusting instinct more than certainty. But not all guidance comes from above. Some knowledge waits beneath the surface, unseen, unspoken, but no less powerful. Now, we move toward another kind of knowing, where vision plays no part, and the ocean is understood not with the eyes, but through touch, rhythm, and memory. Let us listen to the waves, as they teach someone who cannot see, but I can feel everything, story passed from one hand to the next. Story transition. The young voyager drifted farther than he planned, chasing stars he could barely follow, trusting instinct more than certainty. But not all guidance comes from above. Some knowledge waits beneath the surface, unseen, unspoken, but no less powerful. Now, we move toward another kind of knowing, where vision plays no part, and the ocean is understood not with the eyes, but through touch, rhythm, and memory. Let us listen to the waves, as they teach someone who cannot see, but I can feel everything.